My name is Natalie Brooks. The day my grandmother's will was read, my entire family burst out laughing right in the middle of the conference room. Not because they were happy, but because they believed I had received the worst inheritance of all. What none of them knew at the time was that the very property they considered worthless would end up changing everything, including the secrets my family had buried for decades. I am 38 years old. I live in a small town in Vermont. I am not wealthy. I am not successful. At least that is what my family has always believed. While my brother, Ryan Brooks, is a well-known real estate investor who regularly appears in local business magazines, my Aunt Deborah owns a chain of furniture stores across the state. Even my cousins have lives that they proudly claim are far more impressive than mine. As for me, I am just a high school teacher, a divorced woman, a single mother raising my 15-year-old son, Ethan. In the eyes of the Brooks family, that made me a failure. My grandmother Eleanor was the only person who never saw me that way. She always said that a person's worth could not be measured by the balance in their bank account. But no one in the family ever listened. When she passed away in the early autumn of that year, the entire family immediately gathered at the old house where she had lived for more than 40 years. The atmosphere in the living room that day did not feel like a memorial. It felt more like an auction. Everyone sat around a long table. No one spoke openly about money, but money was all anyone could think about. The attorney opened a brown folder and began reading the will. Ryan received an investment portfolio worth millions of dollars. Aunt Deborah inherited my grandmother's collection of antique jewelry. Other relatives received cash or valuable assets. Each time the attorney finished reading a section, satisfied smiles and quiet laughter spread around the room. Then he turned to the final page. The room suddenly fell silent. "The last asset belongs to Natalie Brooks," he said. I looked up. Every eye in the room turned toward me. According to the wishes of Eleanor Brooks, full ownership of the cabin located on Cedar Ridge Mountain will be transferred to her granddaughter, Natalie Brooks. The silence lasted for several seconds. Then Ryan laughed first. "That cabin?" He looked at me and shook his head. "Grandma really left that pile of junk to you?" A few others laughed along with him. Aunt Deborah smirked. She probably forgot to update her will. "That place is practically falling apart." One of my cousins jumped in. "The repairs would cost more than the property is worth." I said nothing, but I could see the disappointment written all over their faces. Not because I had inherited something, but because what I inherited seemed almost worthless. At least, that was what they believed. The meeting ended less than an hour later. Everyone quickly moved on to discussing how they planned to sell the assets they had received. Ryan, however, walked over to me. "If you decide to sell that cabin, give me a call," he said. "The land around that area is expected to be developed soon. I could help you make some money from it." His tone sounded friendly, but his eyes told a different story. I had the feeling Ryan was far more interested in that land than he wanted me to know. That evening, my phone would not stop ringing. Some people advised me to sell. Others offered to buy it. A few even wanted to put down a deposit immediately. It was as if that old cabin had suddenly become important to everyone, and that struck me as strange. 3 days later, I drove up to Cedar Ridge Mountain. The winding road led me to the cabin I had only visited a handful of times as a child. It looked older than I remembered. The paint on the exterior had peeled away. Dry leaves covered the roof. The windows were clouded by years of dust and weather. Yet somehow the place still felt peaceful, as if my grandmother were still there. I pushed open the creaking wooden door and stepped inside. The air carried the scent of old pine. Almost everything remained exactly as it had been. The rocking chair, the stone fireplace, the family photographs hanging on the walls. I spent the entire afternoon cleaning. As the sun began to disappear behind the hills, I decided to go up into the attic. It was the one place my grandmother had always forbidden us children from playing. Dim light filtered through a small window beneath the roof. Old boxes sat motionless in the shadows, covered in layers of dust. While moving a wooden trunk to one side, I noticed something unusual. On a beam hidden beneath years of dust were symbols carved into the wood by hand. Not just one. There were dozens of them. They stretched across the old beams, as if someone had intentionally left behind a message. I stepped closer. My heart began to race, because one of those symbols was the letter E. The first letter of my grandmother's name. I stood frozen in the middle of the attic. The last rays of sunlight streamed through the small window, illuminating the faded markings that had weathered the passage of time. The letter E had been carved deeply into the wood. It did not look like a random scratch. It looked intentional. I brushed away the dust covering the beam. Directly beneath the letter E was a small arrow. It pointed toward the farthest corner of the attic, a place where an old wooden cabinet sat buried beneath layers of cobwebs. A strange feeling ran down my spine. I did not know what I was looking for, but something inside me kept insisting that my grandmother wanted me to find something. I pulled the cabinet away from the wall. The sound of wood scraping across the floor echoed slowly through the attic. A narrow gap appeared behind it. I crouched down and shined the flashlight from my phone into the opening. Something was hidden inside. A small rusted metal box. My heart began to pound. I reached in and pulled it out. The lock was so old that it popped open with almost no effort. There was no gold inside. No cash. Only a handful of old photographs and a brown leather notebook. Everything carried the marks of age. I sat down on the attic floor and opened the first page. The handwriting was instantly familiar. It belonged to my grandmother Eleanor. The first entry had been written more than 40 years earlier. I began to read. Every page felt like a doorway into the past. The notebook was not an ordinary journal. It recorded events that had taken place within the Brooks family, stories I had never heard before, names I never even knew existed. One name appeared over and over again: Margaret. According to my grandmother's writing, Margaret was her younger sister. I stopped reading. Not once in my entire life had I ever heard anyone in the family mention this woman. Not once. It was as if she had never existed. My curiosity grew stronger. I kept reading. The pages that followed contained more photographs. In one of them, 2 young women stood in front of the very same cabin. One was my grandmother Eleanor. The other had to be Margaret. They were smiling brightly. They looked like sisters who shared an unbreakable bond. But then the notebook suddenly changed. The tone became heavier, sadder. Some paragraphs had been crossed out multiple times. Several pages were stained with what looked like tears. I felt as though I was touching a secret someone had spent decades trying to bury. That night I barely slept. I brought all of the documents home. Ethan sat beside me in the living room. Family history had never interested him much. But this time, even he was drawn in. "Do you think Great-Grandma was trying to tell us something?" Ethan asked. I looked at the stack of documents spread across the table. Maybe. Or maybe she wanted us to discover something for ourselves. Over the next several days, I began digging deeper. I visited the local library. I searched land records. I examined archived documents. I looked for anything connected to Margaret Brooks. Then I discovered the first thing that made everything seem suspicious. There was no death certificate. No official missing persons report. No evidence whatsoever that Margaret had died. The woman had simply vanished from the family's history, as if someone had deliberately erased her existence. The deeper I investigated, the more unusual things became. Several parcels of land around Cedar Ridge were registered under the name of a little-known company, but when I traced the legal records, I discovered that the founder of that company had direct ties to my grandmother. I read the documents over and over again. I could hardly believe it. My grandmother secretly owned far more land than anyone in the family had ever known. Its value was worth far more than the old cabin itself. And if that was true, the entire story about the worthless inheritance was beginning to fall apart. Before I could fully process what I had discovered, my phone rang. It was Ryan. For the first time in years, my brother was calling me voluntarily. His voice sounded unusually friendly. "How's the cabin?" he asked. "It's fine," I answered shortly. "If you need someone to evaluate the property, I know a few experts." I smiled to myself. Ryan had never shown much interest in my life. His sudden kindness made me suspicious. Not long afterward, Aunt Deborah appeared at my front door. She was carrying a box of pastries, something she had never done for me in more than 20 years. "Natalie, I think we should go through your grandmother's papers together. There might be something important in there." I looked at her carefully. For the first time in my life, I saw genuine worry in Aunt Deborah's eyes. It looked as though she was afraid I might find something. That night, after everyone had left, I returned to the notebook. Near the very end, my grandmother had written a sentence that sent a chill through my body. If you are reading this, it means I finally chose the right person. The truth is not inside the cabin. It is behind the stone wall beside the fireplace. I slowly lifted my eyes toward the fireplace inside the cabin. My heart pounded harder with every second, because I knew, tomorrow, everything was going to change. Early the next morning, I returned to the cabin. Gray clouds covered the hills surrounding Cedar Ridge. The air was so cold that every breath turned into a faint cloud of mist, but I barely noticed. There was only one thought on my mind: the stone wall beside the fireplace. I stepped inside. Everything was exactly as I had left it. The old clock on the wall continued its steady ticking. The stone fireplace stood in the center of the living room. For years, I had never paid much attention to it. But now, every stone seemed to be hiding a secret. I began examining every corner. Nothing seemed unusual, until Ethan called out to me, "Mom, look at this." I walked over. Near the bottom edge of the fireplace was a stone that looked slightly different from the others. It was smaller, and it protruded just a little. I pressed against it gently. A faint click echoed through the room. Then part of the stone wall shifted. My heart nearly stopped. Behind it was a hidden compartment. Inside sat a metal box much larger than the one I had discovered in the attic. Ethan and I exchanged a glance. Neither of us said a word. We both understood that we had just found the thing my grandmother had spent decades protecting. The box was heavier than I expected. When I opened it, I found dozens of carefully sealed files. There was also a large envelope. Written across the front were the words, "To be opened only after I am gone." I recognized my grandmother's handwriting instantly. My hands suddenly began to tremble. I opened the letter. The first lines filled the room with silence. "Natalie, if you are reading this letter, it means I am no longer able to protect the truth. The time has finally come for this family to face what they have done." I continued reading. Every sentence felt like a hammer striking everything I had once believed. 40 years earlier, my grandmother and her younger sister Margaret had inherited most of the Brooks family estate. Included in that inheritance were hundreds of acres of land surrounding Cedar Ridge. But before the legal transfer was completed, something happened. Margaret was forced out of the family, not by choice, because she had been betrayed. The person responsible was not an outsider. It was Aunt Deborah. I sat there in shock. Then I turned to the files. The evidence was terrifyingly clear. Legal documents, personal letters, property transfer records, signatures. Every piece pointed to the same conclusion. Deborah had manipulated part of the inheritance process. She convinced everyone that Margaret had willingly given up her share. The truth was completely different. Margaret had been pressured into leaving. She had been isolated. And eventually, she disappeared from the lives of everyone in the family. My grandmother was the only person who knew the full story. But at the time, she did not have enough proof to challenge Deborah, so she quietly spent years gathering evidence. I sat frozen. Throughout my childhood, Aunt Deborah had always seemed successful, elegant, respected. No one could have imagined that such a massive secret was hidden behind that carefully crafted image. But the shock was not over. Inside the final folder was an updated land survey. I unfolded it. My eyes widened. The properties that once belonged to Margaret and my grandmother were now located directly within Cedar Ridge's new development zone. Their value had increased many times over. And suddenly, everything began to make sense. Why Ryan had become so interested in the cabin. Why Deborah kept calling me. Why people who had ignored me for years suddenly wanted to be part of my life. They were not searching for family. They were searching for money. That afternoon, my phone would not stop ringing. Ryan called. Then Deborah called. Then the family's attorney called. I ignored every single one of them. A few hours later, Ryan showed up at the cabin. This time, he was no longer pretending to be friendly. "What exactly are you keeping in this place?" he asked the moment he stepped inside. I looked him straight in the eye. "Why do you think there's something here?" Ryan hesitated. Just for a second. But it was long enough. Then he forced a smile. "I just don't want anyone taking advantage of you." I said nothing. But from the look in his eyes, I knew one thing. Ryan knew more than he was willing to admit. That night, a strange vehicle sat parked outside the cabin for nearly an hour. The next morning, I discovered signs that someone had tried to open the door of the storage shed behind the house. Someone was watching us. Someone desperately wanted those files. And that only made me more certain. The truth, hidden inside that box, had the power to destroy reputations that certain people had spent their entire lives building. I looked across the table at Ethan. He was sitting quietly, studying the documents. "What are you going to do now?" he asked. I looked at the files spread across the table, then at my grandmother's final letter. For the first time in days, I felt completely calm, because I finally knew exactly what I had to do. If the Brooks family had spent 40 years hiding the truth, then it was time for everyone to hear it. Directly, face to face. 1 week later, the annual Brooks family gathering was held at the largest hotel in town. It was the event Aunt Deborah took the most pride in. Every year, she organized it herself. She invited relatives, business partners, influential members of the community. She loved being admired. She loved being the center of attention. This year was no different. When I walked into the ballroom, conversations filled the air. Ryan stood near the drink station. Aunt Deborah was laughing with a group of guests. No one knew what was about to happen. Or perhaps they believed they still had everything under control. I looked around the room. Then I glanced at the bag of documents in my hand. 40 years. My grandmother had waited 40 years for the truth to be heard. I was not going to let it disappear into silence. The event began as usual. Speeches, applause, stories about family traditions. Then it was Aunt Deborah's turn to take the stage. She smiled confidently, just as she always did. But this time, the moment she lifted the microphone, I stood up. "I have something I'd like to share." The entire room turned toward me. Aunt Deborah froze. Ryan immediately frowned. I walked slowly toward the front. The atmosphere began to change. "Natalie," Aunt Deborah spoke up. "This isn't the right time." I looked at her. "Actually, I think it's the perfect time." Silence spread across the ballroom. I placed the box of files on the table. Then I pulled out the first letter. "Everyone here knew my grandmother Eleanor," I said, "and most of you believe she left me nothing more than an old cabin." A few small laughs echoed through the room, but they disappeared almost immediately. Because my expression remained completely serious, I opened the letter and began reading, line by line, words written by my grandmother herself, confessions she had protected for decades. At first, people simply listened. Then they started exchanging glances. Soon whispers began spreading across the room. When I displayed the legal documents, the atmosphere grew noticeably heavier. The name Margaret Brooks appeared on the large screen behind me. Many people looked confused. They had never heard that name before, just like me. I told them the entire story, about the younger sister who had been betrayed, about the inheritance that had been stolen, about the manipulated documents, about the person who benefited from it all. Every sentence felt like another mask being torn away. Aunt Deborah was no longer smiling. Her face had turned pale. "Natalie," she suddenly interrupted, "you don't understand what happened back then." I looked directly into her eyes. "Then what about these signatures?" I held up the documents. "What about these letters? What about my grandmother's confession?" Aunt Deborah had no answer. For the first time in my life, I saw genuine panic in her eyes. Ryan immediately stood up. "We should discuss this privately." He said, "There's no need," I replied, "because this has been hidden for far too long." An elderly man from the family slowly rose to his feet. He looked at Deborah, then at the evidence spread across the table. Finally, he shook his head. "If this is true, we deserve to know." Voices of agreement began to emerge, one after another, then more. The room slowly slipped out of control. No one cared about the speeches anymore. No one cared about the perfect image of the Brooks family. People cared about the truth, and for the first time in 40 years, the truth won. A month later, the consequences began to appear. Several of Ryan's major business partners withdrew from an important project, not because he had broken any laws, but because they wanted no connection to the family's scandal. The reputation he had spent years building began to crack. Aunt Deborah's situation was even worse. People who once supported her gradually turned away. Social connections disappeared one by one. No one wanted to become the next person betrayed. As for me, I still owned the cabin on Cedar Ridge. Along with the land my grandmother had quietly protected all those years. But I didn't sell it. I didn't build a resort. I didn't build a shopping center. Instead, I used part of the inheritance to create a community learning center for local children, right on the land my grandmother had loved most. On opening day, Ethan stood beside me. The autumn wind rolled gently across the familiar hills. The cabin behind us had been fully restored. It was no longer neglected, no longer forgotten, just like the truth. "Do you think Great-Grandma would be happy?" Ethan asked. I looked up at the sky and smiled. Yes, I think she would be. Because in the end, what she left behind wasn't land. It wasn't money. It was the courage to stand up for what was right. And sometimes, that is the most valuable inheritance a person can ever receive. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. Sometimes the greatest inheritance is not money, property, or family wealth. Sometimes it is the courage to uncover the truth, even when everyone wants it buried. Now, we'd love to hear from you. If you were in Natalie's position, would you have exposed the family secret or kept it hidden to protect the family's reputation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy emotional family drama stories filled with hidden truths, shocking betrayals, and powerful karma endings, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story.